when the curtain of the future is torn aside. Hey, imagine holding an ancient book, a book written thousands of years ago, penned by countless authors across different times and places, yet, as you turn its pages, you suddenly realize it doesn't just tell of the past, but also reveals the future? It precisely predicts earth-shattering historical events, the rise and fall of mighty empires, and even chillingly specific details about a single individual's life. Sounds like science fiction, right? Well, it's not. We're talking about the Bible, not just a religious text, but a treasure trove of future secrets preserved for millennia. Welcome to the Lost Library Zenion, where we don't just read history, we embark on intellectual adventures, unveil secrets that transcend time, and challenge the very limits of conventional understanding. We are relentlessly curious, always seeking the hidden truths within humanity's most ancient narratives. Today, we won't just tell a story. We're launching an enthralling, trans-temporal, and trans-spatial investigation into one of the most controversial and mysterious aspects of the Bible, hidden prophecies. Are these truly divine revelations, irrefutable proof of an almighty being who comprehends all of time, a grand architect of the cosmos and human history? Or are they merely astonishing coincidences, vague passages cleverly interpreted post-event, meaning they only fit once the outcome is already known? I want you to set aside all preconceived notions, all your doubts, and even your existing beliefs. We will directly confront challenging evidence, sharp arguments, and questions with no easy answers. Are you ready for insights that could fundamentally alter how you perceive the flow of history, the future of humanity, and perhaps even the meaning of your own life? This is a journey you won't want to miss. We won't just seek answers, we'll explore the depths of a text that has shaped civilization and ask ourselves, is there a grander plan unfolding before our very eyes, a plan written down thousands of years ago? To truly grasp the power and wonder of these prophecies, we need to dive into specific examples. We won't just talk in general terms, we'll present detailed evidence, challenging you to reflect on them yourself. Let's begin with cases that have been astonishingly fulfilled, stories that history has written precisely as foretold by ancient prophets. Shocking evidence, when history bows before prophecy. Let's begin our investigation by entering the first secret chamber of this library, where irrefutable evidence is kept. Prophecies that history itself has confirmed to have been extraordinarily fulfilled. Brace yourselves, because what you're about to hear might send shivers down your spine. Is this mere astonishing coincidence, or the indelible mark of a larger plan, an invisible hand that has shaped the flow of time? The chilling fate of Tyre, a bare rock amidst the sea. Imagine an ancient city called Tyre. This wasn't just a city, it was a maritime empire, a flourishing commercial hub, famous for its impregnable walls and immense wealth. Tyre was the pride of ancient civilization, almost impenetrable. But then, around 590 to 570 BC, a voice echoed from the desert, the voice of the prophet Ezekiel. In the Bible, he penned astounding prophecies about Tyre's fate that sounded like a wild fairy tale. In the book of Ezekiel 26 verses 3 to 14, he stated, "Many nations will come against you, as the sea casts up its waves." Meaning many armies would attack Tyre. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. And here's the most crucial detail, the one that makes this prophecy unique: I will scrape her dust from her and make her a bare rock. She will become a place for spreading nets in the midst of the sea. Think about it, an impregnable city to be turned into a bare rock and a place for spreading nets? What happened? History, once again, confirmed it. This prophecy was fulfilled in two distinct phases, centuries apart, by two entirely different empires, with no direct connection. First, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged and devastated mainland Tyre for a grueling 13 years, around 586 to 573 BC. However, after this siege, a part of Tyre still existed, the portion located on an offshore island. The prophecy was not yet complete. And then, over 2 centuries later, in 332 BC, another legend appeared, Alexander the Great of Greece. When Alexander arrived at Tyre, he faced a difficult problem: how to attack a city out at sea. Determined to conquer, Alexander issued a bold and brutal command, a command that sounds like it was written directly from the prophecy. He ordered his army to completely destroy the old mainland city of Tyre and use all its bricks, stones, timber, and even its dust to fill the sea, constructing a massive causeway connecting the mainland to the island. You see? Mainland Tyre was turned into a bare rock, exactly as Ezekiel had foretold. The island city was then conquered, and over time, it gradually declined, becoming a poor fishing port, where fishermen would spread their nets in the midst of the sea, over the ruins of a once great empire. This wasn't just a prophecy of downfall, but the chillingly specific method of its destruction, including the act of scraping her dust and casting it into the sea. Is this just coincidence? Or was there a power that sketched out every line of history? Daniel's fateful dream, history of empires written in advance? Let's turn to another story, more complex but no less impressive. The visions of the prophet Daniel in the books of Daniel chapters 2 and 7. These prophecies didn't just foretell one empire, but a continuous chain of world empires that would rise and fall, spanning centuries, even millennia. In chapter 2, Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's haunting dream of a colossal statue made of different materials. Head of fine gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and finally, feet partly of iron and partly of clay. In chapter 7, Daniel had his own vision of 4 terrifying beasts, each representing a kingdom. A lion with eagle's wings, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and a 4th beast, terrifying, powerful beyond anything seen before, with 10 horns. And do you know what's astonishing? World history has recorded the precise sequence and characteristics of these empires, perfectly fulfilling Daniel's prophecy, which was written centuries, even millennia, before many of these empires formed and fell. Head of gold/lion with eagle's wings, this is the Babylonian Empire. 605 to 539 BC, mighty, wealthy, and dominant like gold. Chest and arms of silver/bear, the Medo-Persian Empire, 539 to 331 BC. Slightly inferior to Babylon in absolute power, silver is less valuable than gold, but still a formidable force like a bear. Belly and thighs of bronze/leopard with 4 wings, the Greek Empire, under Alexander the Great, 331 to 168 BC, swift, powerful, globally dominating like a winged leopard, and after Alexander's sudden death, it split into 4 kingdoms, the leopard with 4 heads. Legs of iron/ the terrifying 4th beast, the Roman Empire, 168 BC, 476 AD, hard as iron, crushing all enemies. Feet partly of iron and partly of clay, describes the dissolution of the Roman Empire into smaller kingdoms and the lasting division of Europe, where nations would attempt to unite but never fully cohere. Iron and clay cannot perfectly blend. You see, the accuracy regarding the sequence, characteristics, and even the complex subsequent division of these kingdoms, all described centuries before they unfolded. This wasn't just a vague prediction, it was a detailed historical roadmap laid out in advance by some source beyond human capability. Is there a grand script being written, and are we merely actors on that stage? The Messiah, hundreds of perfect pieces for a single life. But perhaps the most compelling, the most moving, and also the most chilling evidence for the accuracy of biblical prophecy lies in the hundreds of prophecies scattered throughout the Old Testament, concerning a single figure, the Messiah, the deliverer awaited by the Jews, and believed by billions around the world to be Jesus Christ. Just imagine a scenario, perhaps a few prophecies could be coincidental. But what if there are hundreds of prophecies, written by different authors, over many centuries, foretelling astonishingly specific details about one person's life? Place of birth, Prophet Micah 5 verse 2, written around 700 BC, stated the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, a small, unassuming town. Birth by a virgin, Prophet Isaiah 7 verse 14, written around 700 BC, foretold a miracle. A virgin would conceive and give birth to a son. Lineage, he would be from the line of King David, Jeremiah 23:5, 33:15. Betrayal, he would be betrayed by a trusted friend for a very specific amount, 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 11 verse 12. Method of death, he would be pierced, Zechariah 12 verse 10, his hands and feet would be pierced, Psalm 22 verse 16, yet, strangely, his bones would not be broken, Psalm 34 verse 20, and finally, his side would be pierced, Zechariah 12 verse 10. Burial place, he would be buried in the tomb of a rich man, Isaiah 53 verse 9. Resurrection, and astonishingly, he would not be abandoned to the grave, nor would his body see decay, Psalm 16 verse 10. And do you know what? The New Testament meticulously records that the life of Jesus Christ fulfilled every single one of these hundreds of prophecies, with stunning precision. Mathematicians have attempted to calculate the random probability of even a few dozen of these hundreds of prophecies being fulfilled in a single person. For example, scientist Peter Stoner estimated the probability of just 8 prophecies being fulfilled in one person as 1 in 10 to the power of 17, a 1 followed by 17 zeros, equivalent to flipping a coin and it landing on heads 17 times in a row. When you raise that number to dozens, then hundreds of prophecies, that probability becomes incalculably astronomical, almost statistically impossible to occur by chance in this universe. These aren't just ancient fables or mere legends. These are historical, geographical, and mathematical proofs that compel us to stop and reflect deeply on the true origin of the Bible and its astonishing ability to see the future. Can such a precise convergence of events truly be just a coincidence? Or has some power meticulously outlined every line of history? You see, the evidence for the fulfillment of these prophecies is truly powerful. But I know there's always a part of us that remains skeptical. Counter-arguments from a scientific or logical perspective always exist, and we need to confront them fairly. Are we merely seeing what we want to see? Or are these prophecies truly not as miraculous as they appear? Just coincidence, or a haunting look back at history? We've just witnessed the chilling evidence of prophetic fulfillment. It's truly impressive, isn't it? But let's pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and don't believe anything too quickly. Because, on the other side, there's always another door leading to the cold explanations of reason. Skeptics will never accept these things easily. They put forth sharp arguments, attempting to pull back the so-called supernatural curtain, to find a perfectly logical, unmagical explanation. And we, as seekers of raw truth, must bravely confront these challenges head-on. Are we being deceived by such sophisticated, almost unbelievable coincidences? Or are we simply looking back at history in a haunting way and then fitting it into vague pre-existing texts? Let's uncover these arguments and see if they stand strong. Written after the event, when history wears a prophetic mask. This is the first, and perhaps most intense, argument from critical scholars, those who believe everything can be explained by human hands. The skeptics claim that many prophecies, especially those with incredibly specific details, were actually written after the historical events occurred. Or even worse, they contend that these prophecies were edited or revised over thousands of years of copying to perfectly align with known history. Take the book of Daniel as a prime example. Some scholars suspect that this book wasn't written in the 6th century BC as traditional biblical accounts claim, but rather in the 2nd century BC, which is after the Greek empires had already risen and fallen. If this is true, then, you see, it's not prophecy at all, is it? It's just history disguised as foresight. But is everything truly that simple? Let's see what archaeologists and textual scholars have said as they delved into the layers of history and uncovered ancient evidence. When the golden evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls spoke, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century was a monumental event that shook the archaeological world, an invaluable treasure trove of knowledge. Among them, researchers found copies of the Book of Daniel dating back to the 2nd century BC. This proves that the Book of Daniel existed with its current content by that time. If it was written after the Greek events, it was written very close to them, leaving insufficient time to forge an entire book of such magnitude. More importantly, researchers found no reliable textual evidence suggesting it was significantly edited to fit known history. From ancient translations, other classical texts, like the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, completed by Jews before Christ, dating back to the 3rd century BC, also contain the Book of Daniel. This indicates the book was recognized and widely circulated long before many of its specific prophecies concerning the mighty Roman Empire were fulfilled. The continuity of tradition for hundreds of other prophecies, particularly those concerning the Messiah. They are scattered throughout the Old Testament, written by various authors over centuries. To suggest that all of them were written after the events or systematically altered over many centuries by many different people is an extremely complex hypothesis, far harder to prove than accepting their original authenticity. Could there have been a grand conspiracy spanning millennia to forge prophecy? The evidence doesn't seem to support that. Vague language and flexible interpretation, prophecy, or a whimsical jigsaw puzzle? Another common argument, which sounds very logical, prophecies are often written in overly abstract, symbolic, or poetic language, allowing us to cram all sorts of events into them. The skeptics contend that believers only see fulfillment because they want to see it. They will flexibly reinterpret vague passages, like a whimsical jigsaw puzzle, to fit any historical event that has occurred. A general statement about the fall of a city could apply to hundreds of different cities throughout history, so where's the miracle in that? But is everything truly so vague? While it's true that some prophecies use symbolic or broad language, remember the examples we've already examined: Tyre, Daniel's empires, and especially the hundreds of details about the Messiah. These are extremely specific and cannot be easily twisted to fit any other event. The detail about scraping her dust and casting it into the sea for Tyre is far from vague. it's a specific, unique action. The details about 30 pieces of silver or no bones broken for the Messiah are also not generic. If the prophecies were truly so vague, then why do hundreds of them converge so astonishingly on a single figure like Jesus Christ? Could anyone flexibly interpret to achieve such a probability? That defies all logic and human capability. Pure chance or coincidence, a miracle of mathematics or divine intervention. This is the ultimate argument for those seeking to remove the supernatural element, simply claiming it's just luck, or a matter of numbers. They say that in a text thousands of verses long like the Bible, it's statistically normal to have a few coincidences with history. It's like shooting enough arrows at a wall, some are bound to hit the bullseye without aiming. Just a common occurrence. But can a randomness truly explain everything? This is where mathematical probability becomes an irrefutable piece of counter-evidence. The fulfillment of hundreds of specific prophecies about the Messiah, written by various authors over centuries, all converging precisely on one unique individual, that's no longer random coincidence. As mentioned, mathematicians have calculated the probability of just 8 prophecies about the Messiah being fulfilled in one person is 1 in 10 to the power of 17, a 1 followed by 17 zeros. Imagine that amount if it were money, how vast it would be. When you raise that number to dozens, then hundreds of prophecies, that probability becomes infinitely impractical, almost statistically impossible to happen by chance in any universe. The prophecies concerning Tyre or the empires also demonstrate this. Their specificity and complexity go far beyond the limits of mere coincidence. Self-fulfilling prophecy, when belief unconsciously writes history? Some argue that believers themselves, trusting in the prophecy, unconsciously act in ways that cause it to come true. They argue that, for example, if people believed Jesus had to be born in Bethlehem, they would find a way to make that happen, or at least record it as such to fit their predetermined belief. But can reality be so easily manipulated? This argument completely fails to explain prophecies concerning the downfall of pagan empires like Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, or Rome, empires that did not believe in the Bible or know of these prophecies. How could they self-fulfill something they were unaware of, had no intention of, or belief in? It also doesn't explain details like how Tyre was destroyed, using its dust to fill the sea, or intricate details about the Messiah's death, crucifixion, no bones broken, events beyond the control or desire of people, no matter how much they believe. While skeptical arguments might seem reasonable on the surface, when we dig deeper, we find they face significant challenges and unanswerable questions. The accuracy, specificity, and sheer volume of fulfilled prophecies seem to defy explanation by mere chance or hindsight. This forces us to confront a larger question, one that could change how you perceive this world. If this isn't coincidence, and it wasn't unconsciously created by humans, then what is it? Is there a superintelligent mind behind it all, a grand architect of time and space? If the prophecies of the past have been unveiled with such chilling accuracy, then what about our own future? Does the Bible hold more warnings or hopes waiting to be revealed, and do they relate to your own life, to the very era we are living in? Let's now step into an even more mysterious and contentious aspect: the prophecies concerning the end times and events that will forever change this world. Prophecies about the future, an urgent warning or eternal hope. We've explored how ancient prophecies have torn the veil of history with astonishing precision. That evidence makes one shiver, doesn't it? So then, the bigger question, and perhaps the most important question for each of us in this age, is: If prophecies about the past have been so remarkably fulfilled, what about the prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled? Is the Bible guiding us towards an astonishing future, an urgent warning about what's to come, global upheavals, or a profound hope for a new, perfect world where righteousness dwells? Are we living in the very days the Bible foretold thousands of years ago? The return of Jesus Christ, global signs, are we witnessing them right now? This is the most frequently discussed topic in the New Testament's unfulfilled prophecies, an event believed to forever change the course of all human history. The Bible describes in detail the second coming of Jesus Christ. This isn't a secret event, or one reserved for a select few, rather, it's an obvious, powerful, and glorious event, vastly different from his humble first arrival. The Bible doesn't give us specific dates or times, because no one knows the day or hour, but the Father alone. But it does give us many signs to recognize this period, like birth pains before a major event. And astonishingly, many believe we are witnessing these signs appearing more clearly than ever before. Wars and rumors of wars, look around the world. Conflicts are continuously escalating across continents, rumors of war are relentless, and tensions are rising in many hot spots. Could a major global conflict be slowly emerging? Famines and plagues/epidemics, global pandemics, like what we've recently experienced, and horrific famines are ravaging many regions, affecting millions of lives. Are we entering an era of global health and food challenges? Great earthquakes, the frequency and intensity of earthquakes are increasing, causing terrifying natural disasters, leaving deep scars on the earth. Increase of lawlessness and immorality, society's moral fabric is severely decaying, love is growing cold, people are becoming more selfish, cruel, and violent than ever before. Do you feel society is becoming increasingly insecure? Preaching of the gospel worldwide, despite all difficulties, the good news is being proclaimed to every nation, every people group, across borders and cultures, thanks to modern technology. Is this the preparation for a global event? Persecution of believers, those who follow the faith are still facing hardship, persecution, and even death for their beliefs in many parts of the world. Technological advancements. Some interpreters also link this to rapid advancements in information and communication technology, which not only enables the gospel to be preached globally but could also create mechanisms for societal control in the future in ways never before imagined. Is technology a double-edged sword in the prophetic picture? Are what we're witnessing today relentless, never-ending wars, global pandemics that have changed billions of lives, devastating earthquakes shaking continents, the moral decay in society, and the rapid spread of global information, the very signs the Bible foretold thousands of years ago? This question forces millions to ponder deeply about the meaning of our current era. The end times and judgment day, the grand revelation, fear or a promise of final cleansing. The book of Revelation, the final chapter of the Bible, is at the heart of end times prophecies, a text rich in symbolic imagery yet containing powerful forecasts about the distant future, about a final transformation of this world. The prophecies in Revelation, if understood correctly, can paint a dramatic picture. The appearance of the Antichrist, a powerful figure who will rise, deceive the world with false miracles, and seek global domination, demanding worship from all. The Great Tribulation period, this will be an unprecedented era of global crisis, with immense trials and tribulations falling upon humanity, a painful but necessary cleansing. The establishment of a millennial kingdom, but not all is doom. After these events, the Bible promises Jesus will establish a righteous kingdom on earth for 1,000 years, where he will reign in absolute peace and justice, a golden age for humanity. New heavens and new earth, and ultimately, a new heavens and a new earth, will be created, where righteousness dwells forever, where there will be no more suffering, no more tears, no more sickness, a perfect world, like in the beginning. The imagery in Revelation is powerful and at times terrifying, but it also offers immense hope for a new beginning, a cleansing and recreation. Our current geopolitical developments, global economic crises, or efforts towards a global government, becoming increasingly clear parts of the mosaic that Revelation has depicted, slowly revealing themselves before our eyes? Are these signs of a challenging yet deeply promising future? Israel's role in the end times, the prophetic time clock, nation of theology, the pulse of the final hour? Finally, we cannot fail to mention Israel. This nation is often called the prophetic time clock due to its central and indispensable role in many end times prophecies. The Bible foretold that the Jewish people would be dispersed among all nations due to their disobedience and sin, a curse they bore for nearly 2,000 years. But miraculously, the Bible also says they would eventually be gathered back to their homeland, an event almost impossible by historical logic for a stateless people to be reborn after millennia. Astonishing historical fulfillment. The re-establishment of the nation of Israel in 1948 after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion is an event that many biblical scholars and believers worldwide consider to be the most significant modern-day prophecy fulfilled, a powerful, resounding indicator paving the way for other end times prophecies. Prophecies also speak of final wars involving Israel and Jerusalem, their eternal capital, as well as their central role in the return of the Messiah. What do these prophecies mean for our lives today? Are they urgent warnings for us to prepare for what's coming, to reevaluate our lives? Or are they a source of hope for a bright and righteous future, a world that will finally be restored? In any case, caution in interpretation is crucial. The Bible also warns that no one knows the specific day or hour of these events, so avoid baseless doomsday predictions, focusing only on the major signs. Whether you believe in these prophecies or not, one thing is undeniable. They continue to shape the beliefs of billions and fuel endless debates about humanity's destiny. We are living in an era where the signs mentioned seem clearer than ever before, causing many to ask, are we nearing the end of the story, or just beginning a new chapter in cosmic history? Can you feel the shift in the air, an echo of ancient prophecy? We've embarked on a thrilling journey from the astonishing proofs of the past, confronting skeptical arguments, to peering into the mysterious prophecies of the future that could shape our destiny. Now, let's synthesize all we've discovered and reflect on their profound meaning. Prophecy, pure chance or a roadmap from the Almighty? We've just explored a captivating aspect, a timeless mystery of the Bible, hidden prophecies. From the astonishingly detailed downfall of Tyre, the rise and fall of world empires predicted by Daniel in an almost unbelievable way, to hundreds of specific details about the Messiah's life that history has confirmed with uncanny precision. We've also directly confronted those seemingly logical skeptical arguments about written after the event, vague language, and pure coincidence, and found that they face significant challenges, unanswerable questions when confronted with the sheer specificity and overwhelming quantity of fulfilled prophecies. More importantly, we've looked at prophecies about the future concerning the foretold return of Jesus, the tumultuous global end times, and the indispensable central role of the nation of Israel in these final events. While there are still many debates and different interpretations, one thing is undeniable: these prophecies have been, are, and will continue to shape the beliefs of billions across the globe, forming a roadmap according to which the flow of history seems to be unfolding with purpose, with a plan. So then, after all the evidence, all the arguments, and all the big questions we've posed together, the grand question remains, echoing in each of our minds, is the Bible truly a roadmap to the future, meticulously sketched out by an omniscient being who comprehends all things, a grand architect of time and destiny, who has unveiled secrets for us? Or are these merely haunting ancient tales, astonishing coincidences to an unbelievable degree, or cleverly interpreted texts designed to create an illusion of foresight, a belief we construct to comfort ourselves? For believers, these prophecies are irrefutable proof of the divine origin of the Bible and of the existence of a Creator who holds the universe's fate in His hands. They offer immense hope for a grand plan, a clear purpose for human history, and the promise of a righteous future where all suffering will end, where every mystery will be revealed. And for skeptics, they remain profound mysteries, questions with no easy answers, compelling them to continue seeking alternative explanations, or to concede that there's still much about the universe and history that current science cannot fully explain. Regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of belief and doubt, one thing is undeniable. The prophecies within the Bible have been, are, and will continue to be a captivating subject, challenging our intellect and sparking endless debate. They force us to ask ourselves, is there a larger picture being painted, a grand narrative slowly coming to an end? And are we living in the final pages of a script that was written long ago, even before you and I existed? I want to hear from you, from your very core, from the depths of your mind. After considering this evidence and contemplating these questions, what do you believe? Do you have a different perspective, a bold hypothesis for these biblical prophecies? Challenge me and share your deepest thoughts in the comments below. I'll read every single one of your insights, and I believe we can discover even more together. And if you crave to continue this journey of unveiling timeless and spatial mysteries with the Lost Library Zen-ion, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our next chilling intellectual adventures. We have so much more to explore together, mysteries even deeper than you can imagine. In our upcoming video, we'll delve into another equally controversial and challenging mystery, a place where history and myth intertwine, the secret of Eden and Babel. Do these legendary places really exist? What do science and archaeology say to unravel them? You won't want to miss it. See you in the next astounding adventure at the Lost Library Zen-ion.